Welcome back to From A to Zinc, the supplement podcast bringing clarity to the confusing world of supplements to help you make informed, effective, and safe choices. Today, I'm joined by one of the most respected figures in sports nutrition, Professor Louise Burke. She's a world-leading sports dietitian and researcher who has spent over 4 decades working with Olympic elite athletes, leading sports nutrition programs at the Australian Institute of Sports, and publishing more than 300 scientific papers and multiple textbooks on the topic. In this episode, we dive into the fascinating world of sports nutrition, what it actually means, how to fuel for performance like a professional athlete, and how supplements help before, during, and after training. We will also look at how nutrition needs change depending on the type of sport and how they could differ between men and women. It's a deep dive into the science of performance, from fueling to recovery, with someone who has truly shaped the field from the inside out. Let's get into it. So first of all, thank you for joining me today with your busy schedule.
Lovely to be here.
You have been shaping the field of sports nutrition for over 4 decades, from working with Olympic athletes to rewriting how to fuel for performance. And I would love to ask you, what has kept you so deeply passionate and also engaged for such a long time in this field?
And I think the answer is that there's always something new. Something pops out of left field. In the case of, say, supplements, who would have predicted beetroot juice, the nitrate story? But also learning new things about things that you thought you already had covered is such a surprise. An example here in the supplement world would be caffeine. When I started at the AIS in 1990, we thought we knew everything about caffeine. If I look at what I would use today, almost nothing of that knowledge based in 1990 still applies.
Now, let's start from the foundation then. For anyone who doesn't know, maybe you could explain what exactly is performance or sports nutrition and how does it differ from a normal healthy diet for just general well-being?
The great answer would probably be that every individual needs to think about what they want to achieve in their work or their environment. And in the case of athletes, there's such a variety of performance-based outcomes that need to be underpinned by health. Obviously, an athlete's not going to be able to perform at their best if they're unhealthy, but there are a specific range of goals that they need to achieve, and that needs to be underpinned by certain physiological and psychological and practical aspects of getting them ready. So whether it's thinking about how your body needs fuel or how your body's going to need fluid or what are the different chemicals in their body that help all these processes work, we need to make sure that all the aspects of what makes us tick are ticked off by the nutrients that we eat. One of the interesting things about sport is that because it is so diverse and because even the same event can be practiced under so many different conditions, whether it's environmental or the nature of how many times you've repeated it in a short space of time, the range of combinations and permutations of the nutritional support is almost infinite. And so we need to be really, really insightful about what does the athlete need, and then how are we going to assemble a nutrition plan to make it all appear at the time it's needed. I guess it's a subset of all the nutritional challenges that can occur, but it has a very targeted outcome that we want the athlete to be able to optimize whatever their event requires.
So what I'm hearing that you say is also that approach is very, very personal.
That's right. And you're wanting it to all come together in such a very specific way. And even in the same event, the athlete may not need to do it the same way twice because of all the other variables that are going to be put together in that event.
I think that's a great foundation. Now, when I research about supplements for sports and supplements for performance, obviously I came across a great framework, a globally recognized system for kind of evaluating supplements, and you helped develop and massively were involved to develop this framework. Now, for anyone who has not seen it or who doesn't know it, maybe you could just explain what exactly this framework is and also how athletes, but also normal consumers who are interested in making safe choices can kind of use this framework that I'm speaking about.
So we're talking about the Australian Institute of Sports Supplement Framework. Now, it started off as a program because I was working at the Australian Institute of Sport, And at that time, it was a scholarship-based program. We had athletes, a whole range of residential or occasional camp-based programs where they were working with coaches and sports scientists to help them achieve their sports nutrition goals. At the beginning in 1990, we didn't really include supplements as part of the nutrition plan. In fact, when I came into the AOS at the beginning, I was very much a dietitian who believed, like every other dietitian, it should be food first. And probably at that stage, we were saying food only, that everything that an athlete needs can be found in, it was called like a balanced diet. But let's just say it could come in a food form. We really shunned the notion that supplements would be part of that. Sort of a decade later, as we got round to Sydney Olympic Games, and there's a lot more resources and a lot more focus on how our athletes are performing, we suddenly realised that the landscape had changed. And part of that was because there are a handful of performance supplements that do have the capacity to improve sports performance. And now we need to be inclusive of athletes' interests, and coaches and athletes were already very aware of supplements. And when we were giving a food-only approach, we were simply losing their interest, and they were finding other people or other sources of information about supplements. And by 2000, we had the whole new world of the internet and the ability to get information from 24/7 sources and from influencers as well as scientists. We decided the first thing to do was to change our approach. And rather than saying that it's food only, food first, but acknowledging that supplements, and we started to include things like sports foods and sports drinks within that group of products that we considered supplements. We started to say, yes, they can be part of a sports nutrition plan. It was a change in philosophy, but then it was saying, all right, now we have the coaches and athletes' interests. What we need to do is to say, where is our resource, whether it's our time or our money or our ability to do science experiments to prove things work? How should we best use that around the supplement area? And so we decided it wasn't black and white. You couldn't say that this supplement worked or didn't work, but we decided that if we had a hierarchy of 4 different categories or different ways of thinking about supplements and sports foods, then that probably did the best justification to the levels of evidence and the levels of risk involved in using products. So we came up with a classification of an A group, a B group, a C group, and a D group. The categories still stay the same in the sense of the philosophy behind where we think the usefulness of products are. But as evidence changes about an individual product, it might then move into a different category based on where we think the philosophy of use should be. So with our A group, we said these are things that have a very clear opportunity to enhance the athlete's performance or health, or the underpinning things that eventually lead to performance. We've got a B group, which are things that are just newly emerging, where we've got a little bit of information or a good hypothesis, but we don't have the amount of evidence that makes us clearly confident about them, but we should focus our attention on new research. We've got the C group, which we say it's not that they don't work, but the likelihood that they work to a degree that's going to be significant is much, much less. These sort of are the ones that could distract us and take up a lot of our time and our money, but we feel that if we put them there and say, no, let's get all the other stuff done first, these are really, really low return opportunities. And then we had a D group where we felt that these products are either banned outright in terms of the anti-doping scenarios, or they had a high risk of being contaminated with these banned products. And the idea was that we would then try and focus our attention on the top couple of categories to try and say to athletes, look, you can't do everything. You just don't have enough time and money and brain power to do everything. So let's try and say we're all interested in supplements and sports foods and what they can contribute, but let's focus the resources we have available on the things that are most likely to create some benefit.
But that's a great guidance. And now I would love to get into what supplements to take, when and how. So I would love to kind of break down this idea of how and when to supplement in regards to working out, into physical activity, whatever that sport might be. And I felt like it might make sense, and please correct me if you disagree, to kind of break it down into 3 stages. So the first one being pre-workout, then the actual physical activity, the workout, and then post-workout, because that's, I feel like, how a lot of supplements also, I guess, market their use. And I would love to go through those 3 stages if that's fine with you.
That'd be great. But before we do that, perhaps we could say that even within the group A, you're thinking about the timing of use and what you're trying to address in the athlete's list of goals. But I'm also going to say that there's probably another way of looking at supplements in terms of what are they trying to address. And we've divided our group A into 3 categories on a different basis. And the categories are based on whether this is a product that's actually just trying to address a nutrition need that we know really well, and it's all able to be addressed by the nutrients found in food. But what this product that you're wanting the athlete to consider using is doing is providing a more practical form of everyday nutrients. So it's not garden variety, because, that it's a very important thing that we nourish our body, and that we're not saying that this product has anything different or special to everyday food. It's just packaged in a way that makes it easy for the athlete to consume. And then we have another group of supplements which is saying there are certain nutrients that can be at risk of being inadequate in an athlete's food intake. And so we're targeting micronutrients here. And we're saying at some stages it's possible for an athlete to become deficient or suboptimal in their status. What we're trying to do with the nutrient or the supplement here is provide an amount that can prevent or treat a deficiency. And so often it's an amount that's not found in food because it needs to be provided to the body in a way to improve stores that have become depleted. So it's a medical use.
Is that a specific nutrient that is basically most common here, or is that also very individual?
Well, it is individual, but some of the micronutrients that we often see in scenarios of either deficiency or suboptimal status would be things like vitamin D and iron. So when we're using a supplement in a medical framework, we're usually using a much larger dose than you'd find in food form because we're having to correct a suboptimal status. So it's different from the first group I said, which was sort of normal nutrition, but just in a more convenient form. This is additional nutrition in a form that needs to quickly address a deficiency. And then the third group of supplements that fit within our A group are what we call the performance supplements. So this is now where we're getting into the direct performance enhancing things, the caffeines, the creatines, etc. So within our group, we'll now can apply them in whether it's a before, during and after scenario. But I've tried to explain that there's sort of 3 different ways of thinking where the nutrients need to be assembled, whether it's just practical, additional extra needs that are chasing a medical scenario, and then third, these group of particular things that can be found in food, but what we're doing is isolating them into a way that's going to completely address a direct performance goal.
I think that's a really great input. I didn't know that. So what I think would be the most valuable here, I mean, we could also talk about all of them, but I feel like if we were to assume that we're talking about a normal, healthy person that has no deficiencies, maybe it would make sense to focus on those supplements that strategically support each stage in a way that enhance performance or recovery or whatever it is. But if you feel like there's something else which must be mentioned, please, of course, anytime. So let's talk about the first stage, which is known as the pre-workout stage. Now, out of your perspective, and this is what I think is the most interesting, what is the real goal of that phase? Because I think as a consumer, you would think it's fuel. Is that correct? What is important in this phase? Maybe also what is the timing of this phase, of pre-workout phase? Let's start there and then talk about which supplements actually are important for this phase.
Yes, so fuel is very important, and by fuel we think of what the event needs. So obviously an athlete that's going to do some sort of an endurance event, if you're thinking of someone who's going to do a marathon, for example, the amount of muscle fuel that's going to be required for that is completely different to someone who's doing a sprint race. And so what we might suggest is a good approach to an athlete will vary according to the event, but it also might vary according to some other smaller subtleties around the event. So, for example, if you're doing your marathon in a very hot weather, then you're going to need a little bit more of the carbohydrate fuel because the hot weather will increase the amount of carbohydrate. But also you might say, well, now fluid might become more topical, because even though we're going to sweat in all marathons, if you're doing it in a hot weather condition, then we're going to have extra fluid requirements because of greater sweat losses. But there's also the possibility that what's happened in the days prior to the race, you may have more of a risk of becoming dehydrated just by being out in the sun in hotter conditions, or having done your last training sessions in hotter conditions. So you might have to be more specific of targeting that you've started at the starting line with fluid levels that are high, but you might have even also thought about, can I hyperhydrate? Can I have a bit of extra fluid in my body when I start the race to offset the fact that I'm going to have much greater sweat losses in this condition? And I might also think about what's comfortable in my stomach, because if I'm going to do a high intensity exercise, I don't want a whole lot of undigested food sitting in my stomach. Then you might be thinking about, well, what are some other things that are directly performance enhancing that might be useful in my race? And do these need to be taken in advance of the exercise sessions so that they're available through the whole digestion and physiological process that makes it available at the time I need it? In some situations, caffeine might be useful. I'm thinking of some other situations in shorter distance events using bicarb as a buffering agent to target some of the challenging things that happen during that event, and you need to take it in advance of the event so that it's been absorbed and the buffering capacity in your bloodstream is now increased. Some of the other supplements, such as, well, we talked about the hyperhydration, and if you're wanting to drink extra fluid to offset the high sweat losses in your race, adding some sodium or some glycerol to that pre-exercise fluid intake helps you to hang on to it.
I would love to actually dig a bit deeper into caffeine, because I know you are also the lead author of the book Caffeine for Sports Performance, where you debunk myths and truth about caffeine. Can you explain, for a normal person who might go to the gym or who might have an intense workout, how do you feel about the role of caffeine? How does it work? And do you think it is good for all sports, or is it really something that maybe is just for the marathon runner or the long endurance sports athlete in general?
Well, this is a good example of how things have changed. So if I go back to 1990, I would have said to you, caffeine is something that's very good for endurance performance, and it has its major effect because it changes metabolism of fat and carbohydrate use. And you need to have it an hour before you're doing your event so that it's had its chance to get into your body and start changing the free fatty acid levels in your body that then help you to spare the glycogen that you're going to be using for your main fuel. You need to set it up in advance, and you need to take quite a large amount of caffeine to achieve that. But we've now recognised that there's science that certainly says that that can be useful. But the main benefit of caffeine is something that we all know, just as consumers. It masks fatigue. It does that by changing aspects of our central nervous system that just makes us dampen down the feeling of fatigue or pain or effort, and just makes us able to do what we do for longer without having that declining performance. And that happens pretty quickly. In fact, if you're already starting to feel a little bit fatigued, then the effects of caffeine seem more immediate because it's helping to mask something that's already happening. So the way that we work with caffeine in athletes these days is the same way as every consumer knows. You don't take a bucket load of caffeine an hour before you think you're going to need it, but rather you titrate it into your day around the times that you're starting to feel fatigue. So it just takes the edge off that and allows you to keep doing what you do a bit longer. And we do that as people in our everyday life. We get up in the morning, we might feel a bit tired, so we have a bit of caffeine just to get us going. And then if you're doing some sort of a prolonged task, at some point you start finding that your output's starting to decline a little bit, so that you pop in a bit of caffeine to get yourself back to being able to be on track. That's what we say with athletes these days. In most situations, it's something to look at your event and where these crisis points are going to be, where you start being less effective. And so in a longer event, you might sort of trickle it in different phases, and you might do that in anticipation that this is a part of the race that you need to have special tactics, or it might be based on how I'm feeling at the time. Okay, I'm getting towards the end of the race, starting to feel tired now, so I'm going to pop in some caffeine just to take the edge off that. And we even actually say to athletes these days, don't take it unless you're in that situation, because you can overstimulate yourself. If you're not excited and aroused and ready to go because of all the other things that have contributed to you being here, that's going to be unusual. So we don't like to see athletes dosing up on very large amounts of caffeine. And we also want to make sure that their individual response to caffeine is taken into account. Scientists are doing things in the laboratory, feeding every athlete with the same dose of caffeine, and it was a large dose, and saying, right, we expect the same output. But as everyday consumers of caffeine, in everyday life, you bump into people and they can drink coffee right up until the time they go to bed. They don't think it has an effect on their sleep. And yet there are other people who'll say, oh, if I have anything with caffeine in it after midday, I'm just not going to be able to get any good sleep tonight. So I would be working with an athlete to say, what do you know about yourself and your response to everyday use of caffeine? And it could be your coffee intake. And can we use that information to then make sure that the amount and the timing of the caffeine that you take for sports performance is informed by that, rather than going against everything that happens in your everyday life?
I also wondered if the source of caffeine has an effect here. I don't know if that is studied as much.
There's probably three things to think about in terms of the source. And the first is how much is actually in there compared to what you think is in there. When caffeine studies are done, they use pure forms of caffeine and they put it in a pill so that they can have a situation where there's a control or a placebo pill that's got no caffeine in it, and then we've got the real thing. And that's the way science works. But in real life, when people are going to take caffeine in another form that hasn't been put together in a pill by a scientist, they're going to have to trust that the source that they're consuming actually contains the amount of caffeine that it says. There's such a natural variation in the caffeine source of some things like coffee. You don't know where the coffee beans have come from. You don't know how the barista has brewed it. When we're doing sports performance, it helps to have then a source where we could trust the amount of caffeine. And so sports products have been developed that have added caffeine to them, and you hope the manufacturer's done it in the way that the label says. Now, whether that's in a sports product or whether it's in a beverage for everyday use, you could use that as a source of caffeine that might be more obvious, but it also, you hope the manufacturers behind it have been good with getting that right. So that it's trusting the amount of caffeine is the number one thing. And then the number two thing you think about is, how am I going to consume that? Because we've now got some products like gums and little strips that when you take the caffeine, you're not actually swallowing it. You're putting it into your mouth and you're letting it sit in your mouth and just be absorbed in the cheek cells. And so the caffeine, when it's absorbed across the cheek cells, has a slightly faster rate of becoming available in the body. And that's maybe useful in a sport where you're wanting to have it during the event and time it right for when you need it. Or it could be an event that is so short that there's not time to take it during. And I'm thinking of, some very high intensity short things. And that's where you might have it sort of just before you start the event. You've done your warm up and you're now waiting for the gun to go off. But you have the caffeine in that period just before that. And then the third thing you need to think about your caffeine source is, what else is in there? I have a particular dislike of most of the pre-workout supplements because often they're being promoted as being something to give you this supercharge before exercise, and they have other stimulants in them, or they have unknown amounts of caffeine, because a lot of these have these proprietary blenders and they promote their particular product as being very special, and it's so special we can't even tell you about it. I don't like that approach because it's not an ethical approach. But the other thing, if we're thinking about normal caffeine uses, is that if I'm wanting to use coffee, say, as my source of caffeine for sports performance, and we might be thinking about this in a training scenario, the athlete that gets up and has something before they go out and do their morning exercise session, and they're going to use caffeine, and so they're going to use their normal social or their lifestyle use of caffeine. I want to make sure that I'm getting something good out of it. And tea and coffee have got some really lovely other ingredients in them, antioxidants and polyphenols, But also might have, if I go to my barista, they can also have a lot of cream and sugar and a whole lot of other stuff added to it. And that's actually detracting from the nutritional benefits of it. So you want to think about not just what's the caffeine, but also the company it's keeping.
That's really interesting. And besides coffee or besides caffeine, do you have any other supplements and an opinion on other supplements that are basically known as pre-workout supplements that are either good or not good, or you have had any touch points with, for example, beta-alanine, creatine, tyrosine? These are also other popular supplements that a lot of people take. What is your take on those supplements?
So the beta-alanine and the creatine have a good story behind them, but they're best used in a chronic sense. So that might be something that you take before your workout today, but the best way that caffeine or the beta-alanine works is that you've been taking it on a chronic basis, and what it's doing is building up muscle composition of the special ingredients. So in the case of beta-alanine, you're trying to build up the carnosine levels in your muscle, and that's a buffer. And so that can help with your ability to tolerate high intensity, particularly repeated sprints. And in the case of creatine, you're building up the phosphocreatine levels in the muscle. And the phosphocreatine is an energy store that's used in high intensity exercise, particularly repeated bouts. And if you can build up the phosphocreatine levels in the muscle, then your ability to provide fuel for repeated sprints and to recover between those sprints is enhanced.
What do you then think about stacking caffeine with creatine? That's also something that a lot of people do. Is that something you do in the athlete world?
Yes, and so there are some events where both those products may have a use. They could be taken together. There was a brief phase where we felt that there was a counteractive interaction between those two products, that if you're having them both at the same time, that the caffeine would interfere with the creatine. Now we know that's not the case. So I prefer athletes who have a multiple need for supplements to address them individually rather than buy products that have them all in together at the same time. It can be produced in a product that has the right amount of two different things that you're using for two different purposes. But sometimes in the real world, the supplements that provide that have over-marketed and they put other stuff in there and they're trying to sort of sell the athlete that, oh, mine's better than everybody else's because, look, I've got more things, or I've got some special blend of things. Whereas in many situations in high-performance sport, the athlete's probably better saying, all right, creatine is something that's needed for my performance, caffeine is something that's needed for my performance, and I'm going to get both things in a separate way so that I can concentrate on getting the right protocol. It might be that it ends up being taken at the same time. Usually with these things, there's often a small difference in the amount or the timing that you might use for an event. So targeting them separately and then putting them together in the best way possible is probably more individual than just saying, I'm going to buy something off the shelf that's got both these things and now I don't have to worry about it.
Now let's move on to the phase during the physical activity. My first question here is supplementing during a training or during a competition even necessary, or is it only for certain types of sport? Because I think we all have the picture of like a marathon runner in our head or triathlon runners, and if it's a really long period of exercise that you kind of need to refuel. But for a short period of time, is that really necessary? Is there any benefit?
No, and look, it's often that there's not a benefit because there's not time for you to take something during that race. So you need to have everything on board when you start it. But as you said, in the longer events, there's more chance for these things to either change the need for them, or that you've got a longer event where there's an opportunity for you to consume things during the event and have it available within the time frame of the event still.
And what about electrolytes? I think they're very popular right now. When I go to the gym now or even a workout class, I see everyone with their pink water taking them during the workout. I mean, they taste good and they hydrate you, but do you feel like there's any benefit of having electrolytes during a, let's say, 60 minutes workout class?
It's a real issue of marketing over reality, and things go in phases. So the most important thing that the athlete's probably going to need there is fluid. The degree to which the addition of carbohydrate or electrolytes adds an extra benefit is going to be so situation specific that it's hard to give a general story. But the big thing about nutrition during events is that you've got to have people feeling able and wanting to be able to consume something. So we've got to have a thirst drive. We've got to have an enjoyment of the product. We've got to have an ability to consume it and to absorb it. And in some situations, the electrolyte containing drinks either add a flavour component, or the sodium that's in it actually helps with making you feel thirsty and wanting to keep consuming it. In a very small number of scenarios, the actual electrolytes might provide some help, but sometimes it's more just the marketing or the appetite and flavour element of it that makes that product more useful. Sometimes what the product's doing with all the marketing is just making sports nutrition something that the athlete actually follows through on, rather than having it just sitting in there in the bottle looking good.
Is there anything that you have kind of come across using or giving to athletes in your career that was not good during a sports activity? I'm thinking, is there anything basically that you would say definitely don't take? And of course, something absolutely bizarre, but within the field of supplements, what is not recommended to take during a workout?
Anything you haven't tried before in training would be a good example of that, because sometimes when athletes do an event, it's an organised event where other people have provided some products that are available. And athletes often think, oh, I'm in a race and it's there, so everybody else is having it, so I must use it. And it's got a whole lot of stuff on the label that says that it's going to help me. But if they haven't tried it before, then that could be the worst time to have your first experience with it, in the middle of doing something really important. Whether it's just because you haven't learned to tolerate it, or whether it's because you overconsumed it because you're so excited about having it available to you. There's lots of stories of athletes, having these unfortunate events at a race because they've suddenly used something before and it hasn't agreed with them.
And now let's talk about the third and last phase. That would be post-activity. This phase, I would assume, is all about recovery. Can you tell me how you feel about that phase and what is important here?
So it depends a lot on what you've just done and the effect that it's had on your body. Has it dehydrated you? Has it used up all your fuel stores? Has it caused damage that you need to be able to repair and adapt to? And then the second part of it is, when do you need to be ready again? If an athlete's playing a game of squash once a week, then there's plenty of time between games for them to recover, and they may not need something special. On the other hand, if you're in the Tour de France and you've had a 5-hour race and you're going to do a 7-hour session in the morning, then you have plenty of stuff that you need to get your body doing to be able to front up again to competition. You're going to have to rehydrate, you're going to have to refuel, you're going to have repair of some of the muscle and other tissues that have been broken down or damaged. Protein will be part of the recovery thing. But we're now interested also in a range of special chemicals, polyphenols or other chemicals that are found in some fruits and vegetables that may help with the repair process. So you now see people using things like cherry juice and pomegranate juice and these special mixes of polyphenols and antioxidants that may help the muscle and other parts of the body be able to bounce back from the stress that it's just undergone and be able to repair itself and to reduce inflammation and damage and soreness. Some of these products are in what we call the group B, and that they're still at the stage where it's hard to say that they work 100% of the time. But in scenarios where there's athletes doing extreme exercise and needing to recover very quickly between bouts, then you'd have to say, well, the downside of having something that's got the components of fruits and vegetables, there's not really a downside to doing that. As we're still gathering evidence, this is still probably something that you'd be considering using, because there's evidence moving in that direction and there's probably not a downside to doing it.
One of the most popular products or supplements that people use after workouts are obviously protein shakes. There are some people who have their powder ready and take it immediately after they leave the gym or even while they're leaving the door. Is there really this timing that is important? I know there was this anabolic window. Does that really exist, or is that kind of outdated? How do you feel about the timing?
There's two schools of thought on this, because there are a lot of studies done by lots of colleagues of mine, and including people from our lab, that have shown that when you feed protein to a muscle that has been stimulated either by doing a resistance exercise, which is turning on anabolic processes, or doing the repair of the damage that I've just said before, that having immediate access to those amino acids is going to help an immediate response. And that could help the athlete gain some new muscle for strength or for repair. it's a good thing to make that timing as soon as possible, particularly if you're that athlete we said before. It's not just once a week they're doing this, it's something that they're doing repeatedly. But the interesting point is now, when you look at studies where they've done a chronic application of the use of protein timing, so, we've said over 6 weeks or 12 weeks, if we're doing this all the time, we've gone to the gym every day and we've done the resistance workouts, at the end of 6 or 12 weeks, wouldn't we see that the athletes that have been really specific with that timing will have a benefit over the athletes that have just waited a couple of hours? And unfortunately, the studies don't show as much confidence that it all adds up to a much bigger benefit than you'd expect. And so it's hard to reconcile those two different sorts of science and what they're saying about each other. I certainly think that the timing of intake is very useful for a high-performance athlete where margins of success are very small and where the continual application of these challenges to your body is creating a really big scenario of need. And I think in those scenarios, it is useful to do it. But the most important thing that people need to remember, it's the exercise that's driving the change. And so the athlete that's going to the gym once and forever and then thinking that the protein shake was the real hero of the scenario is wrong. The scenario that you're wanting to say is that getting the exercise done is creating most of the challenge or the stimulus that your body's adapting to. And then the protein side of things is just the icing on the cake. And I still think it's worth, in a high-performance athlete scenario, to do it well. But the margins of improvement are probably something that a high-performance athlete will benefit from, but perhaps the everyday consumer is not going to get the big thing from. Is there a downside to doing it? Well, there's different ways of getting your protein and the timing right, and it doesn't necessarily have to be done through a protein shake. There are lots of foods that you can consume straight after exercise. And if I had to choose between having a yogurt or a yogurt bowl versus having a manufactured protein supplement, I would probably go with the food form because it tastes nicer and it might be something that I'll enjoy more. However, if I'm doing it and I'm on the run and I've finished my workout in the middle of a forest or somewhere where there's not a fridge where I've been able to keep my yogurt and keep it nice, then yes, those protein shakes can be useful because they're easy to be able to consume without having a lot of food preparation or food handling and storage resources available.
That's a very realistic way of just, I guess, looking at it too. One thing that really surprised me when I looked at your classification of the supplements was that magnesium, which is one of the most popular supplements, especially also for taking in the evening, and a lot of athletes swear by it, or a lot of gym goers swear by it, magnesium was not in the top tier. I think it was group C.
So it's an interesting thing. In different countries around the world, magnesium has had a bigger role than others, and it goes back to the marketing and the supplements that are available and, what influencers are saying around the time. And so magnesium has been promoted in the first instance as being something you needed to take during and after exercise from the electrolyte and the hydration point of view, and that was going to be helpful for cramps and the story around hydration. Now, I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest that that's right and that it's sort of a cultural or a marketing concept, and so that's why magnesium is on the C group for that aspect of it. There is emerging interest now in the use of magnesium for other reasons around sleep. This is one that we're sort of keeping tabs on at the moment. And it may be that in 5 years' time, we now say with new information, we might move magnesium for use up into a B or an A. But at this stage, it's premature to say that. As I said, that classification system is really just saying, what's the best bang for your buck? We're not saying that magnesium in C group doesn't work, but we're just saying there's a whole lot of other things in A and B group that are probably more valuable in the sense of you've invested your time and your effort into those. It's more likely that you'll see a benefit. So we've never said don't take Cs. We've just said that the likelihood that you're going to be able to get that right is much less than other things that you could invest in.
Great. So I think we covered the phases. I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you feel like has not been mentioned in one of these 3 stages, but has a really important role when it comes to sports nutrition, supplements for sports?
The last thing I would say is that the supplement industry is not as well regulated as either the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry. And yet a lot of the marketing and the presentation of products makes it look like it's absolutely space age. So athletes really need to have a caution approach to the use of supplements. They need to make sure that they've invested in products that come from reputable sources. And one of the things that's really important for a high performance athlete to recognise is that they can be a risk of contamination with banned substances. I really promote the use of products that have been third party tested by companies that look for those banned ingredients. You can't make it 100% risk-free protocol because not every supplement can be batch tested. And even within a batch, you might take one jar of something and test it and it's free of contamination, but another one in that same batch could have had a small amount of a contaminant introduced. Sometimes the message is, that's only just for high performance athletes. But I think that's a really important thing for every athlete to invest in, even if you don't have a drug test after your event because you're not in that league of sport. The fact that you're investing in an industry to be more careful and to check itself is important for everybody. So it's a non-starter for high-performance athletes to say, yes, we use batch-tested products, but even for lower-level athletes to be able to support an industry to make it safer for everybody, I think is a good thing.
Absolutely. And especially with the certification, there are some companies which explicitly certify for sports and anti-doping substances. My last guess was from NSF, and they also have this NSF Sports where you can really make sure that the supplements are clean. But as you say, you never know, but it's a really important step. I do have one question when it comes to the phases we just spoke about. I wanted to ask you, have you observed any differences in when it comes to maybe a woman or a man, like when it comes to the genders? Do you feel like one phase is more important, like for women? Is recovery the same as for men, or is fueling more important? I wonder if there's any differences.
Yeah, so you've touched on two really important issues there. The first is to recognise that most of the studies in sports nutrition have been done using male subjects. That's a reflection of a poor scientific practice, and I have to put my hand up and say I'm guilty of doing that too. Sometimes it's much easier when you're wanting to study something to say, let's just do it in men because we don't have the complication of menstrual phases and menstrual cycles. It's bad on us. It doesn't mean that what we've learned on male subjects doesn't apply to females. It just means that we have to think through it a bit more carefully and redress that. But does menstrual status, whether it's the fact that females have a menstrual cycle or the different phases of that menstrual cycle, have an effect on the response to something? In most scenarios, we've found that there's not enough of a different outcome to make that the decider of whether you're using a product or not. Females do have different responsiveness. Usually it's an issue that's individual to the person and can't be identified based on whether they're having a menstrual cycle and what phase they're in. It's become a marketing ploy at the moment to say that, we need to have special things for females and we need to have various versions of them because when you're in your luteal phase, you need to take this version. And that's sort of an overreaction, I think, to the lack of female-specific research. What we find when we do our studies in athletes is that, yes, we can see differences in responsiveness of female athletes, and it often is tied to their cycle, but it's individual to the athlete. We often find that some athletes have this response in their luteal phase and it's predictable and it's something that they can learn to manage for themselves, or it's in their follicular phase or whatever. And there may be some differences between hormonal contraceptive users and people who are naturally menstruating. But that needs to be put into the context of that specific individual. And at this stage, there's no evidence that says that we need to have all these different sports drinks and they've all got different compositions because everybody that's in a luteal phase is going to have a different need to everybody that's in a follicular phase. This is jumping the gun, and it may be that down the track we find that there are some differences, but my experience so far and the experience of the scientific community has been that responses are individual to the person and they need to address it on the basis of their experience rather than just say, I'm this in my phase, I'm this in terms of my status, and I'm going to be the same as everybody else that's in that same scenario.
Very interesting. Now, thank you so much for this conversation. I mean, I have learned a lot. I think our listeners will also really appreciate it. It was an honor and a pleasure. I would love to finish with one question, because you have obviously been a part of this community and shaped the sports nutrition world. But I would love to ask you, where do you think, or where do you hope this field is going?
I'm really interested in individualized, not just to the person, but to very specific scenarios. And I don't think our science and our approach of doing scientific studies can get to the bottom of what a lot of athletes are really struggling with. I think that having the use of other approaches, I'm actually working on a project now, whether we can use AI and wisdom of the crowd to be able to get to the bottom of really specific answers. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to supplements, most athletes aren't saying, does supplement X work? They're wanting to say, does supplement X work when I'm in this event? I've done 2 hours of something else before it. I'm taking this and this is this at the same time. It's hot. I'm left-handed and I'm doing something else. They're wanting to get to some completely such a specific level of intrigue that I don't think there's going to be a scientific study that says, oh, yes, those 10 very, very specific scenarios were all incorporated into this study. But we might say that we've got 100 studies that deal with a whole lot of different aspects of it. And then we can use wisdom of the crowd and AI to say those 100 studies, when we synthesize the information that they provide us, can help answer the very, very, very specific question based on our best guess. That might be a way in the future that we can improve those really tricky questions that athletes ask me.
Interesting. Thank you so much. And for all our listeners, if you want to share where people can see more of you, hear more of you, read more of you.
Have a love-hate relationship with social media. I do a little bit, but not my best way of getting involved with my work. Looking at some of our publications, whether it's through the scientific things like PubMed, or looking for ways in which we put it out into social media and into situations like this, Charleen, then that's the best way to hear what I'm doing.
Amazing. You also have some great books, so people can find you all over. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was great.
Excellent. Lovely to talk.